Hello, today is June 17th, 2015, and you're joining us for this week's Basement Research Team presentation on the new paradigm for mankind. I'll just give a very brief introduction and turn it over to Megan. One of the main issues confronting us today is what the nature of the human species is. This is being seen in such things as Greece, where the Troika is trying to force Greece to make incredible cuts to its social welfare programs to the population in order to pay debts that they simply can't pay. And Greece has responded that, of course, they won't give in, and that, very importantly, the principle of democracy is at stake. That the government of Greece was elected based on the notion that they aren't going to give in to these demands. So how could the government do that? It would be violating the very principle of democracy on which European civilization is supposedly based. Another aspect of this is the decarbonizing campaign that was promoted by the G7 in their idyllic meeting in the German mountains, to which Putin was not invited, where they put forward the goal of decarbonizing the world by 2100. How thoughtful of 10% of the world's population to say what 100% of the world will do over the coming decades. And this is also being pushed in the promotion of the Vatican weighing in on this, pushing on a decarbonization policy. Look, this is not based on any science about actual climate change, global warming, anything of the sort. The intent of these policies is to prevent human development and to reduce the human species dramatically down to the level of a couple billion, as promoted explicitly by many of the top people involved in these campaigns, like Prince Philip or by Hans-Joachim Schellenhuber, who believes that the world is dramatically overpopulated. And by not escaping from the kinds of concepts that look at things this way, by not getting out of geopolitics, we have the very real threat of thermonuclear war being created because of Obama's presence in the presidency between the West, NATO, and Russia. So I think that we definitely need another image of the human species, and I believe Megan has some things on this.
Yes, thank you. I'd like to start, I'm going to pick right up on the Monday discussion that occurred between Mr. LaRouche and members of the policy committee, which was a discussion centered exactly on what you just referred to, the fact that the transatlantic system means doom for human civilization. So where is a future for civilization to come from? We obviously see the win-win policy being promoted by Xi Jinping and being adopted by the BRICS nations. But the discussion on Monday centered around the principle which is really at the core of this, which is the necessity of bringing about within human society a coherence of mankind, uniting all the different expressions of mankind throughout the world now, uniting them around a commonality of principle and a commonality of mission. Now, I'm going to let Mr. LaRouche speak for himself and just read a couple passages from that discussion to set the tone. So he said, you have to bring about something which we've lost in the United States. You have to build a certain kind of harmony, a human harmony, where people of different talents become part of a common chorus. And the idea of the parts, the unity of the parts, the cooperation of the parts of the common chorus is the principle of a republican nation. And that's the way you want to organize people, to organize society. What you have to do is to bring a consonance, a symphony of consonants together of people, where all are more or less converging on a common understanding of each other, which is a correct one. So if you take classical musical composition and performance, you have an ideal model for developing the minds of people. And the idea of the chorus is the unifying of a whole population to a common sense of reality and mission, whatever their other skills are, and they rejoice. Not to be too quote heavy, but just one other passage that I think is extremely relevant for what I'd like to go through today. He said a little bit later, the idea is having the true idea of harmony, which resides in something which is a characteristic feature of the human mind. The human mind is prepared only to function with a concept of harmony. And the idea of harmony, as harmony in the form of classical song, choral work, is the model for all harmony in mankind, and everything in life that's harmonical. The machine tool, everything around that you're playing with, is all a part of harmony. And if you don't have harmony, then you have disjunction and you have degeneration. It's that simple. But the point is, the principle by name is very simple. It's called classical artistic composition, music. Music is the medium for typifying classical harmonic composition. Now, obviously, this concept of harmony, harmony among peoples, a principle of unifying very different people who might play very different roles in societies, come from very different cultural backgrounds, national backgrounds. The unification upon a common principle, it's very different from the idea that dominates today in the United States in politics of popular opinion. It's not railing people to cohere or conform with a popular opinion, but it's bringing people to a higher discovery, a higher uniting principle, which is exactly what we're seeing in the process unfolding with the BRICS today. So that principle of harmony, as we've been discussing it, it's not just a musical principle, it's something much more universal, which goes directly at its root to the discoveries of somebody I'll mention briefly in the introduction, who is Johannes Kepler. So our idea today of harmonics, modern harmonics as they're used in music, but also in the way in which they were expressed by Mr. LaRouche, this is rooted in the work of Johannes Kepler, who died in 1630. Kepler discovered the solar system, but he also, in that discovery and through that discovery, established the modern form of well-tempered harmonics as it's used in classical music today, and as it was picked up on very directly by Johann Sebastian Bach. This is not really, I'm not going to go through a full elaboration of Kepler's discovery today, but I will just say a few things to set up the idea. Kepler dumped all previous assumptions about what the solar system was. I mean, he dumped all previous assumptions about what astronomy itself was, and discovered the solar system as a physical system. And the way that Kepler did that in brief is by conceiving of all of the motions of each of the planets and other bodies in the solar system as an expression of the one mover, the sun. And Kepler imagined each of these planets and each of the planetary motions as, you could say, as a member of an orchestra, as playing a musical tone in a musical piece which was conducted by the sun. So each member of the orchestra isn't some independently acting individual that just happens to be in the same room. You have a commonality of mission to play the same musical piece and to play in harmony to express the intention of the composer, but also the conductor who's conducting them. And I have here, people can see more of this on science.larouchepac.com. But you see Kepler demonstrated that the fastest and slowest motions of each of the planets in the solar system cohere to both a major scale, as we have it in music today, and also a minor scale, as we have it in music today. Now, the tuning of these scales, the tuning of these motions isn't a one-by-one relationship with the sun. But what Kepler shows is that each of the planets' motions is modulated so that each is as harmonious with all of the others as possible. And so what comes out is not a simple idea of tuning, but a much more complex, changeable, varied idea of tuning, which we now see expressed in much more developed human music, string quartets, orchestras, and so forth. So for Kepler, there was no real separation between this physical process, which he imagined and then discovered in the solar system, and the principles of human music, which later came to be expressed in the most developed classical music. So this kind of brings us to the real issue at heart with music, which is that, as you see with Mr. LaRouche's idea of harmony, as you see with the way Kepler was dealing with harmony, with music, you're not really dealing with sound. And that might be a strange idea for a lot of our viewers. How is it that music isn't sound? You know, isn't, when you go to a concert hall to hear a concert, aren't you hearing sound? When you rehearse a piece of music, aren't you and you sing, aren't you producing sound? Well, sure, sound is involved. Sound is a certain result that's involved in the process of performance, but music isn't actually sound. It's not built from sound. It's not, the combination of sounds doesn't make music. Now, I also wanted to read another short quote from Mr. LaRouche. So this is from a few weeks ago in a discussion that he had with some of his associates. He said, "The music lies not in the music. It lies in the motive for the music. Otherwise, what does the music mean? It's just a form of noise making. You don't want to make noise. You want to capture the mind of people, not their ears. And the result should come through the mind, not through the ears. You interpret the thing not as it's heard, the heard sounds. What you should hear is the brilliant music of the unheard performance. But you don't have to hear it because you're already captured by it. Your mind is an instrument. Your body and your soul are an instrument of music. It's not the music that makes that. It's the body and the soul which make that. The music is incidental." So I think that's a completely different idea of music than probably almost everybody, certainly in the United States and Europe, have today. And it flies completely in the face of what people accept and tolerate as popular notions of music, sound, entertainment, self-expression, right? But no, what Mr. LaRouche is getting at in that passage, short passage I read, is there's a substance to music which goes far beyond the notes, which goes to this capacity of the human mind to discover, to have new insights and discoveries about the nature of man itself, and to be able to convey and communicate these conceptions to other human beings. And that communication, which we tend to call classical music sometimes, can be clothed in sound, will be expressed in sound. But the motivation is this other passion of mankind. So with that notion of music, which is the notion of music of the classical tradition that Western civilization is founded on. And just as an aside, it also resonates very strongly with the notions of music and art that you find in people like Confucius. But with that standard of art, what I would like to do now is take up a discussion of a very important, specific issue, you could say, in how art is performed today and in the possibility of continuing the performance and composition of classical music into the future. And that is the notion of tuning. Now, it is a fact today that almost every single classical musician, we'll leave the other ones aside, but almost every single classical musician on the planet today, be they professional, amateur, whatever, sings or plays out of tune. Meaning that out of tune in the sense that they are singing in the wrong pitch. So what is meant by that, singing at the wrong pitch? Well, today, as always, if you go to a concert hall and you sit down and the orchestra begins to play, before you got there, or before the performance started, the musicians tuned their instruments. So there's a standard pitch which was played, which all the musicians tuned their instruments to. Now this would also happen if you go to a concert where there's a piano on the stage and you have a piano concert or a singing concert with a piano accompanying. That piano there's a standard pitch which was chosen, and all of the notes were tuned to conform to that pitch as standard. Now, in most cases today, that standard pitch which is chosen, which determines the tuning pitch of all the instruments. It determines the pitch at which the singers sing their songs. That pitch, in most cases today, is high, arbitrarily higher than it should be. In some cases, it's much, much higher than it should be, meaning that every note that sounded is actually a little bit or a lot higher than is natural. Now, this may sound like an issue for music specialists or concert aficionados or something like that, but this is not an academic issue. This is not an issue which is some debate within the music world which has no consequence for politics or anything else, but this is an intensely political fight, and we'll get a little bit into that. This was a political fight which 100 years ago, more than 100 years ago, was waged by Giuseppe Verdi, the great opera composer, who was also a senator in the first parliament of Italy. And this was also a political fight which was begun by Lyndon LaRouche in the 1980s and continues up to today. So I will come back to some of the details of that. But why? Why is this a political fight? And why can you say that there's such a thing as a right or a wrong pitch? How can you say this orchestra is tuned wrong? Who has the authority to say that? Well, nature. Nature has the authority to say that. The human voice has the authority to say what pitch it wants to sing at, how it works best. All music today, be it vocal music, instrumental music, piano music, whatever, all music inherently is based on the human voice and the characteristics of expression of music based in human poetry and the human voice. And the trained human voice, trained by discovered principles of how the human voice actually works, which were developed from the Renaissance on, the human voice operates best when it's tuned to a particular pitch. It does not operate when it's stretched to sing at a higher pitch or even a much lower pitch. And that pitch, which was agreed upon by the best classical musicians of the 19th century, and then obviously, some beyond, is a pitch where middle C, so people who don't know what middle C is could imagine a piano keyboard, and the note right at the center of the keyboard, the key, C, is tuned to 256 vibrations per second. So the pitch of that note, of the string of that piano of that note, is 256 hertz, 256 vibrations per second. If it were more, it would sound a little bit higher in pitch to you. If it were less, it would sound a little bit lower. But the proper natural pitch is about is C at 256, which corresponds to the note above it of A at around 432. So I know that might sound kind of arbitrary to people who don't play an instrument and tune their instrument. So let me play a few examples for you. So the first example you'll hear is recorded from a digital piano, is you'll hear the tone A at the natural tuning of 432. Play it again. So now let me play the same note at the tuning which is adopted in many orchestras in the United States, A440. So maybe people can hear it's a little bit higher in pitch. I'll play the two. I'll play first A432, which is lower, and then I'll play A440, which is higher. So it's a small difference, but it's a difference. And every note of the scale is adjusted up at least that much. Now let me play one more tuning of the note A, which is A450, which is adopted in many orchestras around the world today. So I'll play A432, which is the natural pitch, and then I'll play A450, which you'll hear in many concert halls around the world, supposedly the same note.
Pretty big difference.
That's a very big difference. It's almost a half step. It's almost the difference between two keys on a piano, two entirely different notes. Now, what's the result of doing this? Well, first of all, let's talk about the voices. What's the result of, say, a trained opera singer who shows up in Vienna? Let's say the Vienna Philharmonic Orchestra adopts a tuning today of, I think it's, I wrote it down somewhere, it's 440 something. It's starting to get close to this highest A that I just played. So say an opera singer shows up in Vienna to sing an opera role, and the tuning is much higher than the natural tuning. Well, what's the result? Well, back in the 1980s and 90s, when the Schiller Institute, a branch of our organization, was doing intensive campaigning to return the tuning to the low tuning, we approached many of the top opera singers in the world on this issue, and all of them agreed. The high tuning damages the voices. It stretches the voices. It makes the voices shift and change in the way that they have to with the proper training in the wrong place. Puts a strain on them. It shortens the careers of singers, and it also makes some of the music, which was composed in the past at a lower tuning, unsingable. It actually makes it, in a sense, unavailable to modern audiences because you don't have the voices around to sing that music anymore because of the strain of these arbitrarily high tunings. Now, another result is not just on voices, because again, this isn't just an issue of the human voice, but instrumental music can do whatever it wants. You also have an incredible damage to the musical instruments, violins, for example. So a violin which was built to play at the lower tuning of A432, if we tighten all of the strings to meet the higher tuning, there's now more than 8 pounds more pressure on the body of the violin than at the lower tuning. Now, over time, this causes tremendous damage to this great wealth of Stradivarius violins and all of these wonderful instruments that have become part of human society, human culture. So I think the obvious question is, okay, well, if raising the tuning, well, first of all, if the tuning varies so much from place to place, you never know what you're going to get from one concert hall to the next. But if the higher tunings do so much damage to voices and instruments, who would want to do that? Why would you want to do something unnatural? How did it get to be that way? Did people just forget what the natural tuning was and start to choose whatever they wanted? Well, no, but that didn't happen. The real fight at the nature of this, at the nature of tuning, is a real fight over the nature of man. And it's a real fight over what is music. What is the purpose of music in society? What is the nature of the mind and the life of mankind? That's what's at the root in the discussion of the fight around tuning. So let me briefly give people a sketch of some of the history of the fight over tuning pitch. As I mentioned before, and I'll say again when we get there in the timeline, Verdi in the 1880s, fought for legislation on this question. And as I mentioned before, in 1986, LaRouche launched a campaign to legislate the standardization of international tuning pitch at the low natural tuning of C256 or A432. But the fight goes back much earlier, and I'll just go through a little bit of a timeline here. First, let's start with the classical composers, Bach, Mozart, Haydn, Handel. Well, at their time, there really wasn't a standardized pitch. You could travel from city to city, church to church, which usually would have an organ in them, and the tuning varied widely. But generally what's known is that the tuning that was used by these composers generally was much, much lower than what I played for you today as the modern pitch. So for example, both Handel and Mozart used a pitch which is actually even a little bit lower than the A432 that I played for you. Verdi asked for exactly this pitch of A432 as the natural scientific pitch. Now, The first attempt, which was a certain unofficial attempt to standardize the tuning pitch, came with the 1815 Congress of Vienna. Now, the Congress of Vienna was the international conference in Europe at the end of the Napoleonic Wars to set up a new political structure of Europe. Now, what really happened in the Congress of Vienna was the reimposition of fascism over Europe by the imperial powers of Europe. Now, at the Congress of Vienna, the Tsar of Russia gifted a set of musical instruments to the Austrian military band, which were all at a new high tuning of A440, which was this middle second pitch that I played for you. So now this wasn't just a whim of on the part of the Tsar of Russia, but you had a political operation coming out of the Congress of Vienna to start imposing a new higher pitch in music throughout Europe, which was done via the Congress of Vienna. Now, what's the deal with these new band instruments? Well, they had a much brighter sound. They had a much more dazzling sound, and there are physical, acoustical reasons for that, which I won't get into today, but they had a much more a sound which had much more physical, actually physiological or physical impact on the listener. Now, this set off a total craze, which I'm sure was also created, not just a natural craze, but you had a certain cultural operation where, starting from then, orchestras, bands across Europe began to raise the tuning of their instruments. So just a quick example, the London Philharmonic in 1820 tuned to A432. In 1842, they had gone all the way up to A440, and by 1850, they were at A452, which is even a little bit higher than this last pitch that I played. Now, something similar happened with the Paris Philharmonic and many other orchestras. So this process unleashed by the Congress of Vienna, while you still did have people play at the lower tuning, generally the pitches began to rise all across Europe, such that by 1877, at the Wagner Festival in London, they were playing at A455, which is much more than a half step higher than the natural tuning. In New York City, in 1880, the Steinway factory was tuning their pianos to the same pitch, A457, wow, which is extremely high. Now, in 1858, there was a conference called in Paris, which was actually largely due to the efforts of the composer Rossini, who composed for the bel canto Human Voice, to standardize the pitch. And the idea was, this is insane, we're losing our music, we're losing our voices, we have to standardize the pitch. And this conference in Paris officially adopted a standard of A435, which is very close to the low natural tuning, which was the lowest pitch in use in France in those days. So in 1881, in Italy, largely inspired by what occurred in Paris, there was a Congress of Italian musicians which officially called for Italy to adopt a similar standard in tuning of A432. Now, this was supported by, as I mentioned, the composer Verdi. So Verdi, in 1881, after the resolution of the Congress of Italian Musicians, Verdi wrote a letter to the Italian government, and it reads as follows. Since France has adopted a standard pitch, I advised that the example should also be followed by us, and I formally request that the orchestras of various cities of Italy, among them that of La Scala in Milan, to lower the tuning fork to conform to the standard French one. If the musical commission instituted by our government believes, for mathematical exigencies, that we should reduce the 435 to 432, the difference is so small that I associate myself with it willingly. It would be a grave, extremely grave error to adopt, as proposed by Rome, a standard pitch of A450. I also am of the opinion, with you, that the lowering of the tuning in no way takes away the sonority or the liveliness of the execution, but it gives, on the contrary, something more noble, of a greater fullness and majesty than the shrieks of a too high tuning fork could give. For my part, I would like a single tuning to be adopted in the whole musical world. The musical language is universal. Why then would the note which has the name A in Paris or Milan have to become a B flat in Rome? So that was Verdi. Now, in 1884, 3 years later, the Italian government did officially adopt A432 as the standard tuning pitch for all orchestras of Italy. Now, and then just to mention this, similar motions were taken up in other countries, Spain, for example, Belgium. In 1885, there was an international conference in Vienna, which turned out to be a huge fight. Verdi sent his friend Boito there, who was his librettist, who he worked with very closely, and instructed Boito to fight like hell for 432, or 435 if he had to. Now, that conference was a little bit conflicted. They did eventually resolve for 435, but the point is this was a political fight, and it never quite took hold, and Verdi recognized this. He actually banned performances of his opera Othello if they were going to be at the high tuning. So this was a huge fight. Now, I'm going to fast forward a little bit to 1939, where you have the next major attempt to standardize the pitch internationally. And this attempt was led straight from Berlin by the Minister of Propaganda, Goebbels. So from Nazi Germany comes the request to London to please set up a conference to standardize the international tuning pitch at the same pitch that was used by Radio Berlin, which was A440, the higher tuning. Now this conference did demand a standardization at A440 at the request of the Third Reich. Now, obviously there was a lot of tumult and chaos in the world at that time, so this pitch wasn't actually adopted everywhere as requested. But I do want to mention something else for people to think about. Now, we've gone through a sweep from 1815, well, really from the period of Bach and Mozart through 1815, and then through the time of Verdi, and now up to World War II. What's been happening to music at this time? And I'm not going to get into great detail on it now. We did discuss it a little bit on this show a couple of weeks ago. But there's been a great attack on classical music, especially after Brahms died in 1897. And you have the promotion of an idea of music which is completely based in the senses, the sensuous effect of music. This came with Wagner, the promotion of Wagner, the promotion of Richard Strauss, the promotion of Stravinsky, whose best known work is The Rite of Spring, which is a musical encapsulation of a human sacrifice, which is all induced to create physiological sense effects in the human being, and is promoting the idea that ugliness is music. So that's what's been happening to music over the course of this parallel rise in the tuning. And obviously this is completely contrary to the idea of music as expressed in that quote I read from Mr. LaRouche about the powers of the human mind of discovery. Now, so that was 1939. There are more attempts made after World War II to standardize the pitch, which largely began to take hold. I know people can't read this, but I'll at least show you that even so, even in the 1930s and 40s, while the pitches were generally rising, even so, it was still agreed upon that the scientific pitch was C256. And this is just two examples. One is actually a physics manual that was released by the US Army. And it says right away that the scientific pitch is C at 256. And then the other example is from a phonetics textbook from 1931, which again asserts that C256 is the scientific tuning, and that if you raise the tuning, sopranos and others have a hard time singing music. So that so I mean that was the fight, and the pitch keeps rising. The pitch has risen throughout this period. Today, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, as two examples, in Vienna the standard pitch is A444. In Berlin it's A448, which is incredibly high. So now I just want to get to kind of bring it to a conclusion. I want to get to what this organization has done since 1986 to fight for restoration of the lower natural tuning and to save classical music and save this precious power within society. So in 1986, as I mentioned, LaRouche launches the campaign to save classical music, calling for legislation to lower the tuning. By 1988, we had contacted the top singers in the world. A couple hundred of them had signed our petition supporting such a call, and we had worked with two senators in the Italian parliament to introduce legislation in Italy, once again, to lower the tuning pitch. So this grew. I'll say something more about 1988 in a moment. This grew. Our organization sponsored seminars with demonstrations of the low tuning versus the high tuning and the more truthful expression of the music that you hear in the lower tuning as opposed to the high tuning. We eventually got thousands of signers to this petition, which included, like I said, the top Placido Domingo. I'll just name a couple names people might recognize. Placido Domingo, Carlo Bergonzi, a famous tenor, Piero Cappuccilli, Mirella Freni, many, many others. We got thousands of signatures of singers, singing teachers, instrumental musicians, all calling for this. Now here's a couple pictures people can see. This is the press conference announcing the legislation. Here you see Liliana Gorini, who's the Italian representative of the Schiller Institute in the middle. Next to her is the great baritone, who you will meet in a moment, Piero Cappuccilli, accompanied by others, including the senators from Italy. Here's Carlo Bergonzi, who gave a seminar with the Schiller Institute at Carnegie Hall in New York City, demonstrating the superiority of the lower tuning. And what I'd like to show now is a clip of one of the demonstrations that was done. This was in 1988 in Milan, which was the first of such seminars where who you'll hear is Piero Cappuccilli. Other people who spoke were Helga Zepp-LaRouche, the chairwoman of the Schiller Institute, Renata Tebaldi, who's one of the greatest operatic sopranos. Interestingly, Tebaldi made the point that the high tuning, it doesn't just affect sopranos or tenors or people who have to sing high notes. It's not about that. It's about the natural placement of the voice. And she said that even basses and altos and mezzo-sopranos who have to sing low notes are adversely affected by this displacement of the human voice. So what I'd like to do is play this video for people so they can hear what you'll hear is a short passage from an opera aria by Verdi, and you'll hear it 3 times. You'll hear it once at the low tuning, then you'll hear it at the high tuning, and then you'll hear it at the low tuning again. And I would also encourage people afterwards to go back and rewatch it if you need to. something else point out before we hear the low tuning again. So he was pointing out that because the tuning was artificially high, he had to do things to shift his voice on the highest notes, which Verdi didn't intend. It changed. He said it changes the color.
Yeah, he didn't intend a color change at that point.
Exactly, but the voice had to in a certain strained kind of way. So now the low tuning again. So, I mean, I think you can hear the difference. I would encourage people to go back and keep listening to it. But, so this was, as I said, this unleashed a total brawl, a total freak out. And the legislation that was introduced in 1988 was eventually defeated upon intense pressure from the United States on the Italian government not to pass it. Wow. So it should make people think, why would something like that, if music is just whatever you want, you know, why would something like that be such an issue? Why would the oligarchy go to such efforts back in 1815, but then obviously now in 1988, to stop an effort to standardize the tuning pitch? Well, what's really the issue here, right? The issue, as I said, it really does come back to, what is man? What is the power of music for mankind? Is it arbitrary? Is it whatever you want? Well, what does that lead to? Look around society today. Look at the entertainment culture that has led to today. Versus what would be possible if we had a culture which was dedicated to the truthfulness of this kind of music, of the kind of principles that are involved in developing and maintaining that kind of music in society. And yeah, I mean, I think that absolutely is the core of our political mission today. And that's something which the United States and Europe in particular can offer as our offering of some of the best of our culture to this collaborative process that's taking shape in the world today. So I think I will leave it at that.
It's almost as if you had decided, if you disallowed the universalization of language, as though you were to say, no, you can't have a national language. It should just be arbitrary, however you would like to, whatever types of noises you'd like to make, that should be your way of communication.
I think it's really, you know, when you'd, you know, all the gesturing that he was making. I'm glad you pointed out what he was referring to, that he was changing the color of his voice to sing notes in different ways. Because you had mentioned that Renata Tebaldi was pointing out that it wasn't only a high pitch makes singing high notes really hard, but that all of the notes are in the wrong place because, and that's something I think is an astonishing thing in itself, that these different types of voices, a tenor, a bass, that doesn't only mean you're higher or lower. Could you say anything about the internal characteristics of them?
Yeah, briefly, yeah, sure. So every voice, every human voice has the potential to be developed and trained according to what we refer to as the bel canto technique, which isn't just something from Italy from a long time ago. It's actually recognizing the natural physiological potentials of the voice. So each of what we call the species of voices, so take women, sopranos, mezzo-sopranos, and altos or contraltos. Each of these voices in and of themselves has different natural areas of the voice which have different color characteristics. So taking a soprano, the way in which a soprano will sing low notes versus high notes has to do with a different mixture of the resonance cavities, among other different things that she'll learn with vocal technique. Now those changes from when the chest resonance is dominant to the middle to where the head resonance is dominant. You don't just do that when you feel like when you want to. There are certain notes in the scale where for every soprano that naturally occurs. Certain very specific areas where she will pass from the middle to the higher resonances. That's naturally determined. And when you start to raise the tuning pitch, you start to confuse the area at which that occurs, and it causes physiological strain on the voice. But it also, somebody like Verdi, who composed his music with these different colors and qualities of the voices in mind to give expression to the poetry, it messes up the poetry if you're doing that at the wrong place by necessity, whether it's a high note or a low note.
Or if you'd end up by the tuning singing right on an edge where neither way of singing is really quite right.
Mm-hmm.
Now you said she. Is it true that all children, including boys, are sopranos?
That's true, yes.
Okay.
all children are sopranos.
You brought up truth in music, the existence of truth in culture. Now, using this as an example, that if we can't maintain the standard of, hey, there is a standard of truth in this, then look at all the other things that this leads to more generally, if there's no truth in culture. And you had mentioned in your introduction about how music wasn't only sounds. I was wondering if you'd like to, this gets a little bit further from the tuning issue that you brought up, but if you could discuss at all about the unheard aspects of, I guess what I'm thinking of is, I know you've got a presentation that you're working on, an article, web page, that includes the ironies of inversions and how it is that the mind hears things that the ears don't. And that sometimes there can even be a contrast between what the mind hears or expects versus what the notes indicate. Could you say anything about the substance of what music is?
I can try.
That's not too big a demand here.
Yeah, well, maybe a couple ways to get at it. Briefly, the first way I'd like to just reference Furtwängler. Furtwängler, he lived in the terrible 20th century and conducted in the midst of all this degeneration that was going on. And toward the end of his life, he took to writing about music, not because he thought that was the best idea for a musician, but because the culture was becoming so ignorant of musical principles that he felt like he actually had to write to try to express some of them. So he discusses an idea of a certain particular kind of tension that has to be present in any musical performance. And the tension he's discussing is the tension between the now, the moment that you're in, and the whole composition. So the moment that you're in, you imagine being a performer, even if you're not a musician, imagine being a performer and playing Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. And as you play, you're playing your notes and you're intoning the notes in a particular way. There's a certain causality of the moment of how you play and move from note to note. That's in time. But there's something else which only comes into existence once the last note has sounded, which is the whole, the impression of the whole, which it doesn't exist in its completely in any particular part, right? It's this unity of the process of development which has occurred over the stretched out time of all the moments. So Furtwängler discusses this tension that the musician is never only in one or only in the other. The musician is always experiencing how the moment is affecting what will eventually be the whole, and how his foreshadowing, in a sense, or how his insight into the whole, which doesn't yet exist, affects the way in which he unfolds the moment. Now, that's only possible with compositions which are actually expressions of real ideas, not just some stupid thing that you might hear on the radio today, some pop music. that's only true of compositions which actually intend to express a certain insight into the human mind, the human power of conceptualizing something about human beings, something universal about human beings, which is guiding every moment of that composition. So only things which are composed in that way are susceptible of it. And examples of that are, I mentioned Beethoven, also the fugues of Bach are incredible from this standpoint, the sonatas of Mozart. LaRouche mentions quite often, and for good reason, Schubert's Ninth Symphony, particularly Furtwängler's conducting performance of Schubert's Ninth Symphony. Now those things that I just attempted to describe, you don't hear those with your ears. You don't hear this tension of the moment and the whole with the ears. And yet that really is the principle which is determining the composition in its entirety and which can be shared among many people with many sets of so-called ears. It's not in the sounds, it's something which is before the sounds in a certain sense.
That also very much assumes that there's something that is universal about the human mind. And otherwise you wouldn't be able to say, I could write music that would move any human mind.
Exactly, which is accessible to any human mind. Not accessible in the popular sense,
Right.
but in the sense of the same way a scientific discovery is accessible.
Right.
Good. Great. Well, I imagine that there's much more material on the Schiller Institute site, and it sounds like there's been a lot of work done recently on this. It'll be available to help people understand this difference. Pretty telling. One pitch advocated by Verdi, one pitch advocated by Hitler's propaganda minister.
Right. Well, I should also just mention quick, lest I give the impression that this is something which died in 1989. I mean, our organization has never let up the fight for the return to the lower tuning. In fact, we did a performance of Mozart's Requiem in 2014 in Boston in honor of John F. Kennedy at the lower tuning specifically, and made that exactly a part of the intervention. So this is something which has continued and is part of our intervention into Manhattan now.
Right. Good. Well, thank you very much. And thank you for joining us. And I'm sure we're going to have more on this and related subjects. So we'll see you later.